Well, hello, you good people who I haven't seen in 2 weeks. You good people, it is Peikoff Wednesday. It is time once again for Keeping It Real with James Valliant. James, how are you doing on this fine, man, I missed you. How are you doing on this fine Wednesday?
I missed you too, and I was totally jealous that you and Amy were in Japan. I saw some pictures. It looked like great fun. You guys are going to have to do a whole episode on just your trip to Japan. It looked like it was great fun. I terribly missed you last week, but great to have you here home. And I'm spectacular, as you know, and doing particularly spectacularly well right now.
I saw your episode last week with Jeffrey Young. That was an outstanding episode. I made all sorts of notes, and it's great because he's like a professional version of my own amateur advice. There's so many things that the two of you talked about. If anybody missed that episode from last Wednesday, go to the Ayn Rand Center UK channel and give that a watch. I love the references, for example, to the difference between your aspirational values and your actual values or your lived values, because you talked about internet dating, you talked about dating in general, relationships in general, and yeah, as objectivists, as just rational people who hold values in high regard, we sometimes do checklists. We think, yeah, I'm gonna find somebody to date, and she's gonna have these 7 virtues, and she's gonna have these 3 values, and she's gonna and then we don't look in the mirror and say, well, but what does that actually look like in reality for me? Do I live those 7 values? And I do, but how does that actually look? So I
Right.
loved that. Is it Dr. Young, Mr. Young? Jeffrey Young did such a great job talking about, if you're going to date, you're looking to date a real person and not just this checklist of values. And how do you treat the wait staff, and do you look at yourself? And there's so much good advice in that episode. So I'm glad to hear that you missed me, of course, but such a great job that you did
The
last week.
fount of wisdom. Now, I am no host like you. I do not live up to your, certainly missed your hosting skills. And that feeds into maybe our theme here today, where, where I want to talk about mistakes I have made, because that whole episode was predicated on a mistake we made about the direction of swiping. About the direction of swiping on a dating site. And even a modest mistake like that, I felt like, oh, geez, I got to get someone on to correct. But of course, there was much more value. Jeffrey is a fountain of wisdom on such matters. He really is. Thank you very
Well,
much.
I am a fount of wisdom on mistakes. And I say that not in a self-deprecating way, but because I've actually spoken on the subject. And Mrs. Nasir, Amy Nasir, has given a whole lecture at the great 2011 Chicago Minicon. She gave a talk. I put a link to that already in my notes online, making mistakes. So we have talked about this before, but for all the great analysis that she did, and she used the Fountainhead as her springboard for that, and the mistakes that Howard Roark makes, I remember back in 2011, the reception that we got was positive, but there were a few people who were cagey about that. What do you mean Howard Roark made mistakes? What do you mean the ideal man still makes mistakes? And fortunately, most people understood. And once they heard Amy's talk, they got it. But when you mentioned, yes, let's do, the consequences of error and talk about Ayn Rand's characters, well, you sent me a great list of questions. Leonard Peikoff's answers to them clarified that matter entirely for anybody who had a question about it. And I want to jump in with it, although I think we may talk more about Japan and last week's talk and all of that in this conversation. Now, first and foremost, folks, there's going to be spoilers. There's got to be a few spoilers because we are talking about the mistakes of Ayn Rand's characters. And as you said, James, big ones and small ones. So let me jump in with question number 1, folks. If you have a tolerance for spoilers, or if you're already Ayn Rand fans, you are going to love this. Would Howard Roark, Leonard Peikoff was asked, would Howard Roark look back on his decision to build Cortlandt Homes and say to himself, I made an error in judgment? Now, again, there's a few, James, you know these folks. I've been this guy who would say, what do you mean Howard Roark made a mistake? Howard Roark never made a mistake. But Leonard Peikoff answers, yes, I agree with this totally. That's one of the differences between Roark and Galt. Roark is learning. He does not know about people. He's not fully clear on a lot of things that Galt knows. Of course, Galt learned them from the fact that Roark existed. You stopped the answer from Leonard Peikoff there. When you heard that or read that, depending on how you took the answer, and I heard it both ways, Did that one surprise you a little bit? You know, Galt benefited from the fact that Roark existed.
It's just brilliant. Well, he's pointing to the development in Ayn Rand's thought and to the development that we can get from understanding even heroes, even truly great human beings, striving to be moral in the comparison between the two. But she makes it very clear in the Fountainhead that Howard Roark has important philosophical lessons that he has to learn, things about human nature that he still doesn't understand, which by the end of the novel, he's learned through his experiences with people, and he shares his insight with everyone at the end. But there is much more philosophical education going on here with Howard Roark, right? In Atlas Shrugged, we sort of see moments where Galt has this inspiration, such as at the 20th, his experience at the 20th Century Motor Company and stuff. But then it all becomes quite clear, and from a moment like that, he doesn't really need to learn an important moral or psychological lesson like Howard Roark does. And so that contrast actually makes good sense from the reader's perspective. We're not told that Galt ever learned about this architect named Howard Roark, but obviously they're two different stories. But there is a relationship there. Galt is sort of her hero cleaned up from having to learn any significant lessons along the way, apart from very early on. We see him have light bulbs go on, and from then on, he's morally enlightened.
Yes. Yeah, by the time we meet Galt in the story, he's already been through that journey.
Exactly.
That's for sure. But you're right to point out, well, he learned it at the 20th Century Motor Company,
Right.
the same way that Howard Roark learned it throughout his architectural career. Then jump to question number 2, which is also on the Fountainhead. But before I do, I want to acknowledge in the chat, we got announcements that both Xenophage 2112, didn't I just do a show on Rush?
Oh, what a great show that was.
And speaking of Rush fans, also Chris McGraw, they are both in as members on the YouTube channel. Besides being a member of the Ayn Rand Center UK, which you absolutely should do at aynrandcenter.co.uk, you can become a member of the YouTube channel for a few extra pounds a month, a few extra dollars. Your comments are highlighted. You have access to special emojis. You also have access to some YouTube feeds that other folks don't have. You can watch the YouTube version of some of the study groups that go on. So definitely do that. Help support the Ayn Rand Center UK. Make shows like this possible. Welcome to Xenophage 2112 and Chris McGraw. Good to see the chat is active as well. Would love to see some super chat as well. If you want to make your comments stand out and support the ARC UK, go ahead and do that. And let me jump right to question number 2 here, because it's also regarding the Fountainhead. In the Fountainhead, why does Ayn Rand refer to Howard Roark as a religious man and have him build a temple? And Leonard Peikoff starts off his answer. This is a very short answer. He says, well, she would not have done that after the Fountainhead.
Oh.
Now, some of the answers today really surprised me. And that was one where he starts off, she would not have done that after the Fountainhead. She would not have done that after the Fountainhead.
Wait. Did Ayn Rand? I know objectivists would really get freaked out about that one. You're telling me that in one of her important books, Ayn Rand made a mistake? Alert the media, gasp.
Well, she certainly had a development in that regard. Yeah. You want her to, you want to meet her later in life, like you meet John Galt later in life, already with all the conflicts worked out.
Right.
But Leonard Peikoff says she has said that she did so in the novel only because she regarded her atheism as so well known that no one would take the reference to Roark's so-called religiousness seriously. She was using it as a symbol of man's striving for the very best, for the ideal and for the perfect, and not settling for anything less. It was, in effect, man's aspiration to the highest. She accepted it as a symbol in the novel, but later she didn't. Close quote, Leonard Peikoff.
And you can read Ayn Rand coming clean about this mistake in her introduction to the 25th anniversary edition of The Fountainhead, where she corrects herself on a couple of things that she did in the novel. She said that in the original version, she used the word egotist, when egoist would have been more exact. And that she regarded as, sort of a terminology mistake that wasn't that significant. But she said the other one was, even though in the novel, it's made clear that Howard Roark is an atheist, there is the moment with Stoddard where he's asked, he's told, Mr. Roark, you're a profoundly religious man. And Roark agrees. And Ayn Rand regretted the implication that left with some people in some people's minds. She said in other words, she wouldn't have put it like that. She would have treated it differently. She liked the symbol. And as she explains in the introduction why she used the temple as a symbol, because she thought religious concepts, many of them can be applied to this world and should be applied to this world. But able to explain her wider motive, she then said, in effect, I wouldn't have done it. I wouldn't have just flatly called him a religious man without further explanation or context. So, ladies and gentlemen, not only did Howard Roark make a mistake, Ayn Rand herself is coming clean on making a mistake. Now, if you think about it, it's a mistaken implication, one that she could easily explain in that introduction, why she did it. And she does make clear that Howard Roark was an atheist, but on the other hand, it left an impression in some readers' minds that she didn't like. And she wanted to be a clear communicator. She was a dazzlingly clear and precise communicator. And so to her, even leaving that implication open was, she should have done it differently in her own mind. Yeah. Isn't it fascinating? There's Ayn Rand coming clean about her own error of judgment there.
Mm-hmm. And I'm almost inclined to disagree with her, because the scene itself, even without the context, but it's explicitly a man asking Howard Roark to build a temple. I'm doing this from memory, but Hopton Stoddard says, I want you to build this temple. And Howard Roark says, Mr. Stoddard, I don't think it would be right for me to take this commission. You see, I don't believe in God.
Right.
How you can't get any more explicit than Howard Roark. And then, of course, Stoddard answers with the lines that Ellsworth Toohey fed him
to deceive. Right.
Well, that doesn't matter, Mr. Roark. You're a profoundly religious man. I can see that in your buildings. Well, that to me, I think
the interesting contrast here is that we can see that taking Cortlandt Homes and depending on Peter Keating and his committee of second-handers was a mistake in judgment on Howard Roark's part. You'll notice how this is treated by Ayn Rand as a mistake in judgment on her part, not Howard Roark's, which is really an interesting distinction if you want to think about it. And there in the middle of the Stoddard Temple, of course, is the statue of a beautiful naked woman in the act of worship, in the act of looking up and venerating at the highest human value that she could. The scene of actually the creation of that sculpture is itself a dazzling moment, but it is as secular a temple as you can possibly imagine. But the point is that even leaving the implication that Howard Roark was somehow religious, and that can have mystical and supernatural implications. And Ayn Rand, even there, she didn't want to leave that implication even open.
Yes. I'm taking a look at the chat here, and thank you, Equal to Reality, who says, yay, Robert is back. Yay, I'm back. I am glad to be back. I appreciate that. And Wes Stewart is in with a super chat. Thank you very much for supporting the Ayn Rand Center UK. And he says exactly the response I think a lot of us had, but he says it very wittily. What? Ayn Rand wasn't born knowing what to do in all contexts at all times. She had to learn things through experience like the rest of us. Blasphemy, I say blasphemy. Thank you.
Blasphemy. No, Ayn Rand had a definite, she's a remarkable genius, and she had a great deal of the really the basic approach to her philosophy early on in her life. But nonetheless, Ayn Rand had a massive learning curve. Objectivism does not occur to someone overnight. No. She was a human like the rest of us, who learned from experience, who learned from her own thinking. And objectivism is the product of her own volition, her own hard creative. She was a hard thinking life, not just a hard working life. And objectivism was a product of all that. But yeah, Ayn Rand wasn't born knowing. She didn't spring from the head of Zeus fully armored like Athena.
Yes. And it's one of the things that I loved about, for example, the lecture Amy gave, or the episode her and I did on making mistakes, is precisely that it's context laden. It's real life. There are people who've criticized, and we've talked about it, Ayn Rand, compare her to Dostoevsky, who is rich and dark, and it's like real life and the real stuff that really real people see. And I thought none of us see that stuff. We love Dostoevsky because of the richness, but that's not real life. Real life is
You know,
like the development.
outside of a courtroom, I've never met a serial killer.
Yeah. Real life, the richness of real life is the mistakes and the learning and the development of a Howard Roark or Dagny Taggart, the unraveling the mystery of life, figuring out how to live our own best lives.
Right.
And exactly right. Oh, in the chat, Amy says, in my mistakes talk, for the record, I didn't use the religious idea as an example of Rourke's mistakes. I thought his saying he doesn't believe in God was clear, but yes, it was important for Ayn Rand to be more clear. So yes, thank you for that, Amy. And we've been straddling the line. We've already gone from Roark to Galt. So since we're already bridging universes here between Atlas Shrugged and the Fountainhead, question number 3, are Robert Stadler and Gail Wynand similar in their mistaken belief, their mistaken premise, namely that we have to deal with unintelligent people, so we have to rule them? Whose guilt is greater, Robert Stadler and Gail Wynand?
Well,
That's interesting because most of us, we love Gail Wynand and we hate Robert Stadler.
well, there's so many attractive features to Gail Wynand.
Yes.
Right. Whereas Robert Stadler really doesn't have as many. Okay, he taught Galt physics, but apart from that, I'm not sure I have a lot of respect for Robert Stadler. Whereas Gail Wynand is a fascinating person. His aesthetics, his judgment, his intelligence, all make him a sort of an attractive character in some ways. Yeah, but here we go from minor mistakes of implication, mistakes of learning. Far from, on the one side, we have very modest mistakes in knowledge. Ayn Rand was very keen on saying, distinguish carefully between breaches of morality, dishonesties, evasions, willful breaches of morality versus innocent errors of knowledge. Now, make sure they're really innocent errors of knowledge. But if it's an innocent error of knowledge, let's say take the way we swipe on a dating platform. There is an error that's simple, easy to correct, and was an error of knowledge because I have been out of the dating scene for 26 years.
Really, I think you're underplaying the potential disaster that could be.
Underplaying the potential disaster. The point, though, is that all mistakes have consequences, even innocent errors, even little innocent errors of knowledge can have consequences, serious negative consequences. Our mind is our tool of survival. Getting our ideas to correspond to reality is a vital life and death matter. And whether it's an innocent error or a willful error has potentially negative consequences to our life. There's no question about it. Now, if it is a breach of morality, then we're talking about something about you that needs to be changed, right? It's not simply, oh, I didn't happen to know that. And that makes them much more difficult and much more important to change because it implicates your character and the rest of your life. An innocent error, hopefully, and again, your virtue in approaching that innocent error, admitting the mistake, being rational, being grateful for correction, knowing the importance of getting these things right. So, for example, oh boy, what a treasure trove of errors of my own. Stuck and picked. But an error I made a couple of weeks ago with Mark Pellegrino, for example, it just accidentally came out of my mouth. I knew perfectly well that Up from Slavery is Booker T. Washington's 1901 biography. And with a slip of the tongue, because we were also talking about Frederick Douglass, I said Frederick Douglass. A complete slip of my tongue, but an error that I'm grateful right now to correct, to have this opportunity to correct. But you see, even that error of knowledge can have negative, or simply it wasn't an error of knowledge even. It was, this coming out of my mouth and my brain not connecting. Sometimes that's what happens. We just say the wrong thing. Even that can have consequences.
Yes.
That's what makes morality so important.
Mm-hmm.
That is what makes morality. Innocent errors by themselves can have negative consequences. There is no excuse to commit an error that we could have and should have avoided had we had our principles straight.
Yes. Now you're making a really important point here, and so I want to give it just a moment. You're making several really important points, as you usually do. But first of all, we've got a super chat from Roland Horvath, who is in for $5.99 in euros, which I think are still trading high. And he says, to suggest she didn't spring fully grown out of Zeus's head, heretics. Well, thank you for that super chat there. And James, you said that as well. But this idea that mistakes have consequences, even honest errors, is a fascinating one. And that is ripe with wisdom in what you're saying. Let's go back to a classic story, one of the early protests that Amy and I were being involved in Objectivism. And it happened that somebody at the protest accidentally hurt Amy, injured her physically, just bumped into her in a way that was very painful. And she, had her reaction, ouch. And the person who did this, I won't go into details because I hate to call people out, but to make the point, looked at her a little bit like almost as if he was the one injured and said, oh, well, I didn't do that intentionally. And he didn't. It was just an honest mistake. He accidentally hurt her. And the implication was, since it wasn't intentional, because it wasn't a moral error, it wasn't a moral failing on his part, it was an affront that she was in pain. And I've seen this before in other contexts where people will say, because it wasn't a moral failing on my part, I shouldn't have to apologize, or there shouldn't be any consequences for, I accidentally hit your car, but there was no way I could have known better. And I know that. I know people who say it's wrong to say I'm sorry if it wasn't my fault. And you're making a great point, James. I think folks need to accept that there are mistakes we make that have no moral importance. And yet, you're right, they have consequences in reality, and we need to adjust accordingly, do whatever we've got to do about it. And sometimes that's going to mean saying, I'm sorry, even though there was no moral failing on your part. It's simple manners and acknowledging that, well, yes,
if I was in another town and that happened to Amy, I'd be sorry for Amy, right? And
yes,
there are times in life, just to use that as the analogy, where that accidental bump, that it was truly accidental on my part, gave me pause to think, well, maybe in this context, I need to be more careful. Maybe in future, I need to be aware of, crowd. I'm in a crowd, people are pushing around, whatever that is. Maybe I need to develop, because I see now the consequence of not doing that. Now it may become modest moral issue, but it's now getting onto my radar of this is something I need to attend to. And sometimes just learning that this is a thing I need to attend to. In the crowd, I think there's a more, most people should be aware that it's a pushing crowd, but there are plenty of contexts in life where I have to learn that wider context, a pushing crowd, can cause a problem. I wasn't even aware that, using that as a metaphor, of course, just as an analogy, there are equivalent contexts in which I say to myself, I wasn't even aware I could hurt someone that easily. And now I'm alert to it. And now that it's on my radar, my mental radar screen, I'm now thinking about that. And when I'm in a similar situation, I'm much more mindful of what I'm doing. Now, that's the point. We need to raise to the level of our explicit awareness all of the potential benefits and hazards that come from the consequences of our action. And our actions are, there's really, if you think about it, no neutral action that we take. I don't want to make people paranoid and be ultra, super hyper vigilant about every little mistake they make. But on the other hand, truly, everything we do there's no neutral action towards our life. There really isn't. Whether I take a nap, whether, I have dinner at this restaurant, you think about the most ordinary prosaic, well, it could be this or that decisions. Really, there are none. Some are far less consequential. Some we know the consequences of right up front. And so I don't want people to walk around on eggshells afraid of everything they're doing. But the truth is that even our simple decisions in life will have consequences. And this really points to the need to think conceptually, act in principles, and attend to the important stuff. And the only way to do that is with ethics. with moral principles, and to keep thinking about moral principles and keep thinking about generalizations in this way of how we interact with life, so that we can constantly update and improve our behavior and reduce the chances of even innocent mistakes.
Right. And again, accept the fact that there will be innocent mistakes that we still need to attend to.
Absolutely.
It's why we buy insurance. It's why we say we're sorry, even when we committed no moral failing, because there were consequences to our actions.
Precisely.
Apologies don't mean guilt. Well, sometimes they do.
No.
Sometimes they're simply acknowledging a
Even an
reality.
attempt to make restitution. If I was the direct cause of something, I feel obliged. Is there something I could do to make up for this? Even if it was an innocent error on my part, because I know there was consequences to my action.
Right. And I would make the point that it's a good reason to be wealthy. And I don't necessarily mean physically, monetarily wealthy, but to have generosity of spirit.
Yes.
So that it doesn't feel like a self-sacrifice to apologize for bumping into somebody.
Right.
When it wasn't your fault. Well,
right.
So what? I have such a richness of values in my life that I am happy to make up for something, even if there was no moral failing on my part. It's why we buy insurance. It's why we do the things that we do, because life has risks and we have to attend to those risks, including the ways in which our lives affect other people.
Now, Gail Wynand and Robert Stadler, though, their
Yes.
mistakes are a little deeper than, and because you see, well, let's get Dr. Peikoff's answer here.
and he makes three important points here. He says, I'll agree that yes, there are definite similarities between the two in the way the questioner, phrases that second-handedness. But I see some big differences, Leonard Peikoff says. First of all, Stadler, as presented, has no values other than theoretical mathematical equations. Just, in other words, Platonic ideas in another world. Wynand, though, he has the art gallery. He has Dominique. And of course, when he finds him, he has Roark. So Wynand is a man with independent, real, worldly values, which he betrays unknowingly. Stadler is a detached intellectual without love, without anything except a world of equations. Now, secondly, you said they both tried to rule people. Well, yes, but there's a difference. Wynand tried to rule them by catering to them through yellow journalism. Stadler tries to rule them by political means, by force, by weapons that he's going to use against them.
Ooh, yeah.
Even before Project X,
right.
Establishing the Institute.
Right.
On that count alone, whose guilt is greater? And then Leonard Peikoff wraps up like this. The obvious difference between the two is that when Wynand sees Roark, he recognizes the truth. In effect, he falls in love. That's the end of his course. So he comes back to his real values, even though he's defeated. When Stadler sees Galt, he hates him. He realizes he's the enemy. He's the one who has to be destroyed. So the differences between Wynand and Stadler run all the way through. And couldn't agree more with that.
Wow. And what this brings out is that even where you could say, hey, Wynand as a human being is a far more attractive and interesting figure than Stadler. They both make errors of such a fundamental kind. They both make such profound mistakes philosophically that the consequences are going to be equally significant. There's a huge difference between, let's take Ayn Rand saying, yes, Howard Roark's a religious man in a way. That error is easily correctable. It contradict, there's evidence within the Fountainhead that contradicts it. It's a much simpler error to, quote, fix, and it's a much more modest error in its consequences, it would seem to me, for the careful reader at least. Whereas Gail Wynand and Robert Stadler have made a fundamental philosophical error, and big long-term consequences are going to have, well, in Robert Stadler's case, he's so evil that it's going to literally cause the death of lots and lots of people. He really is a killer in that sense. Gail Wynand's error being bad, it hurts people. In fact, in the course of the novel, we see him hurting people that he should not have hurt. But the person at the end of the day he hurt the most, himself. Howard Roark was able to correct his situation, and he came out okay. The person Gail Wynand most destroyed was Gail Wynand. And so you see, an error of that kind can be utterly self-destructive.
Yes.
We get to an error, we get to a level where the error is so profound, your whole life, at the end of the thing, he becomes like a Javert. Gail Wynand, oh my God, the whole premise of my life is mistaken. Everything I'm pursuing has been based on a wrong view of humanity and life. And boom, there's really no nice, pretty ending to that if you've dedicated your whole life to it. It is an act, in effect, compared to Stadler's, an innocent error, of course. Stadler has the psychology of what would be a mass murderer. And that's the difference. Think of the consequences in the world of that genius's fundamental error and evil and dishonesty, I would say. Robert Stadler is one of the most evil characters in all of Ayn Rand's literature, in my view. And you can see the difference that Ayn Rand is showing in the consequences. Gail Wynand, at the end of the day, mostly destroys himself, although he does hurt other people along the way. Stadler is going to be a mass murderer at the end of the day.
True. How many people?
Spoiler alert.
Yeah. How many people die as a result of Ellsworth Toohey's work versus Robert Stadler's work?
Yes, indeed.
As indirectly as that is, that's exactly how it turns out. We're going to talk a little bit more about Gail Wynand as a second-hander, but first, thank you to Walter. Walter Bishak is in for €2. Thank you very much for your super chat. Equal to Reality is in for £5 and says, oh, great to see you back, Robert. Looking forward to Amy and your takes of adventure. Yes, we'll do that on Sunday. And he says, this is a great topic. I agree, James. This was a great one to come back to. Now, it does mean that we pushed forward an interview that we were going to do today, but we're going to give ourselves an extra week to prep for that. We are going to be talking to Catherine Dickerson again. Now, you'll remember we talked to Catherine Dickerson, folks who saw that interview, about parenthood effectiveness training and other forms of effectiveness training. And this was in relation to a course she was going to give that was originally set up through the HBL, Harry Binswanger's letter, Harry Binswanger's list. We're going to have Catherine back. We're going to talk about how did that training go. In fact, she's going to be coming with a couple of the folks that she has worked with in PET. We'll be talking more about that. I'll be hyping it up on the social networks. We'll talk about it on other shows as well, because this is going to be good. Next May 3rd, Catherine rejoins us.
Don't miss it. The last one was I found it very helpful and insightful. We did not make a mistake in having her on, did we, Robert?
Zero mistakes. All the consequences were good.
We're going to repeat that good decision, that virtuous decision. May 3rd, please join us.
Yeah, that will be next week. And again, we'll be publicizing that one more. You'll be hearing more about it. That is going to be good. We'll talk about it again at the end as well. I want to jump to question 4, though, because again, regarding Gail Wynand, he was asked, Leonard Peikoff was asked, is the character Gail Wynand in the Fountainhead a second-hander, i.e. one who lives through others? Well, seems like we already have the answer to that, but Leonard Peikoff explains further. He says, well, I would say no in regard to his soul and character. He has independent convictions, independent values, true self-esteem. That's what Ayn Rand tried to convey by saying he was not born to be a second-hander. She meant not that it is innate, but that the fundamentals of his character are valid. Now, in the course of action, the actions that he chose, though, yes, he is a second-hander. He chose power lust, and as a means to achieve it, pandering, keeping his values hidden, making himself subservient to the choices of others. In Ayn Rand's mind, in judging people, their action is decisive, not their inner soul, if their soul contradicts their action. That's why, for instance, in We the Living, it was Leo she admired, much more so than she did Andre. Andre has a better, stronger soul than Leo, but Andre carried out all the bloodshed in action. Leo held the right ideas, and so far as he could in a dictatorship, carried them out, or at least didn't betray them. That to me is fascinating.
What a
because
fascinating contrast on this very issue, the difference in the kinds of errors that people can make. Leo would have been a successful, happy man if he had not existed in a dictatorship.
he had
And
the soul of Francisco.
had the soul of Francisco. He could have been a happy, successful man had it not been for the fact that he was in a dictatorship. But having the kind of soul that he had made it impossible for him to be happy or succeed in a dictatorship. He was a person of independent soul, and so he's crushed. So we see him decline, and we see his, in effect, decadence as the manifestation of what happens when a person is completely stifled. Can one look up to that and admire it? No, Leo is a tragic figure in that sense. It's utterly sad that what he's going through. Another equally tragic figure is Andre, right? Andre, though, is a man of action, and he is capable of working with these dictators. And if his mistake is that, look at the consequences. And he, at the end of the day, he sees horrifically his acting on those consequences had a far more deadly effect. See, Leo is destroying himself. Leo is self-destruction that's consequenced when you stifle a person's freedom. Andre, on the other hand, realizes, no, I was using force for an ideal that was in fact a deadly ideal, an anti-life ideal. And he learns that through his experience with Kira. But how do you make up for that? How do you know that at the end of the day, Andre realizes, oh my God, look at what I've done. Look at the devastation that I've wrought, in effect. So there are differences in when you look at someone and you say, well, that person's not happy and successful, or that person's not happy and successful. It is all important that we distinguish between the situations and the contexts there. And there's a huge difference in the kinds of errors that people can make. Look, if you're trapped in a circumstance beyond your control, like Leo, what kind of self-destruction is left available to you is really the only choice. in the case of Andre, and so action is what Ayn Rand, like Peikoff is saying, action is where where the rubber meets the road here. Andre put into action a huge mistake that involved lots of other people. Although Andre is an extremely noble character in many ways, an idealist and an intelligent man and so forth. And when he finds Kira, you can see he's value committed man. On the other hand, his mistake is so egregious and so horrific that, again, like Gail Wynand or Robert Stadler, even if the mistake was innocent at the beginning, you've implicated your whole life. There's some mistakes, huge tragic consequences are going to happen, and they can't be avoided.
Yes. And in that regard, it's interesting for folks who've read the early the notes from Ayn Rand about the early work on Atlas Shrugged. We know there was originally going to be a priest in the story, and Ayn Rand wanted to set up an honest priest, a priest with integrity, who finds out over the course of the novel that his religious beliefs contradict his integrity. And we think, well, yeah, I can see why that character didn't work out. Of course, that character couldn't work out. But isn't that Andrei Taganov? Isn't that a man who, again, his primary virtue is his enormous integrity? But he starts off with he's an avowed communist, and he does his best to live up to his beliefs in the most noble way they can be lived up to. And ultimately they can't, and it destroyed him. So when I think of the priest in Atlas Shrugged, I think it would have been a version of Andrei Taganov's story, except, hopefully because he would join the heroes, he would not be fully destroyed by the contradiction.
Right. Very interesting. Ayn Rand said, in 20th century America, it would just be hard to make that character believable. That a truly committed religious person could be a hero, that posed certain challenges of implication for her.
Yeah.
Whereas, this is interesting, a communist who'd been initially drawn into the Bolshevik ideas at the start of the Russian Revolution is an entirely different guy. That is almost believable to her.
That was believable.
Because it happened in reality that she saw around her.
Yes.
Whereas in America, she found far less believable excuse. Even for the most, let's say, rational Thomistic priest she could possibly conjure up, it would still be unbelievable for her to that kind of character. And I think I can see that. But you're absolutely right. He would have been like an Andre character, someone who would have seen that I made a fundamental mistake in my thinking that really messed up my whole life. I bet he would have been a tragic character too, like a Cheryl.
It's fascinating to think that in some ways we were more religious back in 57, but in some ways she could see that religion's on the decline and you can't make a realistic story with that character. And the reason I bring this up is the next question, and its answer totally threw me for a loop. I would not have guessed in a million years. Big spoiler alert for folks who have not seen the movie version of The Fountainhead. It's probably not that big a deal as a spoiler, but I'm going to mention it. I hate to give spoilers, but you've got to hear this. Question number 5. In the movie version of The Fountainhead, why did Ayn Rand change the storyline to show Gail Wynand committing suicide? Now, James, I have had mixed reaction to the movie because the book is so great and the movie's good, but differences and changes. And I don't think Gary Cooper really understood the character. But that scene, I thought, well, Ayn Rand had to change the plot to fit it within the context of a movie, length. And no, I was totally wrong in all of my assumptions. Leonard Peikoff says, well, you will never guess. And he's right about that. I never guessed. Says, you will never guess, especially those of you who are young. She made a change like this because the Catholic Church would not allow divorce.
It was the darn Hayes Commission.
Movie screen. People who read The Fountainhead wonder, why did Dominique have to go to Reno to get a divorce from... People don't remember getting a divorce used to be a difficulty, and it used to be a mark of shame, and you wouldn't wear a white dress at your second wedding, and it's a whole different context.
Hollywood was different too. In the 1930s, there was a complaint that movies had become too risque, so they developed this commission that would sort of monitor big Hollywood movies and to see if they met the moral test and could be shown to a family audience in America. And boy, did they give advice. They didn't just give advice, they sort of commanded MGM and Warner Brothers to do movies a certain way. And there's certain conventions. If you do a bad thing, you can't have a happy ending. It has to be a moral lesson here, especially if it involves sex. So the idea of Dominique, in the Fountainhead, the idea is, well, Dominique will just divorce Gail and then go with Howard Roark, and no big deal. Maybe just get a divorce. But you're right. Back in those days, you had to sue for divorce. There had to be grounds for divorce. There wasn't these, no-fault divorces like we have today. Oh, we made a mistake. Let's just part ways, which makes a lot more sense to me legally. But actually, the Morals Commission said, no. She just can't remarry Howard Roark after divorcing Howard Roark's best friend. No. That's not going to ethically work here in the late 1940s. We have to make the point that he dies. Now, it is connected to, she could do that literarily, because even in the novel, you see that Gail Wynand's realizes that his whole life he is like a Javert character from Les Mis, who does commit suicide because he realizes his whole life was a mistaken premise, based on a mistaken premise. So I think it works in the case of Gail Wynand. Even in the novel, I was left with what's left of Gail Wynand? What's left for him to do? It's almost as though suicide is still on the table for Gail Wynand, in effect, where we leave him. It's like, oh my God, the poor guy is left hanging with no chance for happiness left in his life. So it wouldn't be surprising, in effect, if you learn, let's say, in a postscript to The Fountainhead, oh yes, Gail Wynand committed suicide at some point, that would be hardly surprising. On the other hand, she didn't want to be explicit about that in the novel. We get the idea that he's realized his whole life was based on a mistaken premise. In The Fountainhead, she could tighten it up that way, but she wouldn't have preferred to tighten it up that way. It was the darn Hayes Commission. They didn't like, there were lots of things they didn't like about The Fountainhead, The whole so-called rape scene from the Fountainhead, for example, where Ayn Rand called it, if it was rape by engraved invitation. They had to make that really, really, really explicit, that engraved invitation in the movie, and you'll see that in the movie as well. So unfortunately, one of the things that did affect the Fountainhead as a film was this morals commission in Hollywood that's basically had the right to approve or disapprove of the content of major motion pictures.
Yes. The times they are a-changing. Now, who would have thought, though, in 2023, that religion would be back in force? And that's a whole different discussion, but oh my God, how did we get here where, oh yeah, we have to remember what was going on in religion and how Ayn Rand saw, of course, the future religion would continue to decline. And
Right.
today's conservatives are just determined to drag us back to a society where we are all governed by the Hayes office.
Right. Exactly.
Unbelievable. So rather than get into that, because we have done whole shows, for example, on conservatives and anti-abortion, and we will talk about that again. I want to jump to question number 5, because this one gets a little less out of the details and more into a little richer in the philosophy aspect. And this is really, to me, one of the most important issues in objectivism. Ayn Rand has talked about this too, as if you get this, you get objectivism. Question number 5. In Atlas Shrugged, Eddie Willers says to John Galt, "You look as if you've never known pain or fear or guilt." Now, why does Ayn Rand include lack of pain as a fundamental attribute? Hasn't Galt felt more pain than anyone else in the book? And that was the question Leonard Peikoff was asked on his podcast. And he starts off his answer this way. He says, yes, in a sense. The Galt has felt more pain than anyone else in the book. But Ayn Rand makes a major distinction between pain over a concrete and pain over the universe as such. In terms of concretes, Galt had a lot of losses, a lot of pain. He had to abandon his motor. He had to watch Dagny fall in love with another character. He had a number of things that he had to live through. Well, this is the point, though. He did not conclude that the universe was pain, that life itself was pain, and that the universe was malevolent. He did not take the view that pain is fundamental, that defeat, failure, and so on is his lot, because he was an Ayn Rand hero. The most he would say is, well, I am suffering concrete now, but I hold on to the conviction, as long as he's still free to speak and act, that I can achieve my values ultimately. I have my confidence, my passion for values and for thought, and that remains with me. It's those fundamentals that give him the cast of his face. Closing Leonard Peikoff's quote here, that's the face without pain or fear or guilt that's referred to in the novel. And then Leonard Peikoff wraps up like this. Howard Roark in The Fountainhead described it as pain that only goes down to a certain point. In this case, in Ayn Rand's case, the character's face is intended to show his metaphysics. It's the same way that a man could have a lot of concrete pleasures. You could see by looking at him that he is basically unhappy. Now, unquote Leonard Peikoff. That was interesting that he gives the contrast, because I think we've all seen that. We've seen the pleasure seeker who's often laughing and goofy and silly, and yet when you look in their eyes or you just look at their face, you can see this is not a happy person.
Right.
And Galt was the opposite of that.
Whatever
he was going through, you could see this is the face of a man with no pain, no fear, no guilt.
Right. See, Don Watkins said something very profound that has always affected me. He said, happiness is not about the weather. It's about the climate. It's the values and the attitude you bring to life. And one of the things that this answer brings out is that you can know suffering and problems and even serious pain. I mean, look at Galt. He sees Dagny, in effect, fighting him with the John Galt line. He sees Dagny falling in love with the inventor of Reardon Metal. He's in love with Dagny Taggart, and he has to endure that and watch that whole thing work out. Now, he's confident about what he's doing, and so he's happy through the course. Now, think about that. He's happy through the course of circumstances that are painful and difficult. See, it's not the weather that determines whether or not John Galt's face has pain, fear, and guilt or not. It's John Galt's own attitude that he brings to it, his understanding of life that he brings to it. But here I wanted to, with this question, bring out the fact that even the most virtuous person, even a person who isn't making a single mistake, can know suffering, can know bad consequences. People die. The woman you love may fall in love with someone else at the time. You may face enormous career challenges in your long-term goals. And those things don't imply any mistake on your part, innocent or otherwise, but we can still know pain. The only way to carry on with life is to have that attitude of John Galt, to know you're doing the right thing, to know you are, what your values are, and that you're capable of achieving them. That's the climate part that we should bring to life. If you, like you say, if you really understand objectivism, what objectivism is teaching you is not that life is, an automatically happy. Once you adopt objectivist virtue, you will have no more problems and you'll be perfectly happy the rest of your life. No. Objectivism doesn't make any such claim. What it does make the claim, if you are principled, if you are moral, if you are being as rational as you can be, you can reduce the possibility of those to the lowest end possible, and increase your odds of long-term success enormously. So if you have any real chance at success, you have to be rational, moral, and principled. You're courting total disaster if you don't do that. Innocent errors are common enough, and those cause problems. Even if we don't make any innocent errors at all, we can still know suffering and challenges. So all the more urgent that we think about what we're doing, that we integrate our knowledge into concepts and principles and bring to bear that knowledge every time we make decisions. And with every significant decision we make, we have to be rational about it. Whatever the consequences, I'm happy if I've made that rational decision because I'm exercising my capacity to deal with the problem. Whatever the consequences. So, it is urgent and vital that we be philosophical. It is a life and death matter that we follow principles. We court absolute disaster if we don't, because after all, life is complex enough as it is. No one is omniscient. No one is infallible, as Ayn Rand said repeatedly. She said it in Atlas Shrugged. She said it elsewhere. She said it in Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. Man is neither omniscient nor infallible, nor can human beings avoid the consequences of their actions. So we better do our level best to know the consequences of our actions and to use our minds, our conceptual faculty, and integrate our knowledge into principles so that we can bring to bear all of our knowledge and be successful in life. Gosh knows, just walking down the street, we can get struck by lightning. There's enough challenges in life that we don't want to just walk around with a metal pole over our head during a thunderstorm. No, indeed, we probably want to stay indoors during a bad thunderstorm. So it's vital. This is what stresses the vital necessity of rationality and of morality, frankly. Life is a difficult and challenging thing as it is. And we are by no means omnipotent nor infallible. So it just stresses the need for ethics, it seems to me.
See, it's one of the reasons I love doing shows with James Valliant. James, we did not talk about how we were going to wrap this up, this conclusion, this talk today, but that is exactly the point that I was hoping we would make at the end. Just as in epistemology, we are not infallible, and yet we can achieve certainty. So in action, in life, we are not incapable of making mistakes, and yet we can achieve success. And that is the whole reason to adopt these virtues, not so that we never have a life with any errors or with any pain in it, but precisely so that we can pick ourselves up. The point has been made before. Amy made the point in her talk on mistakes. It's not the falling down, it's the not getting back up. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to have errors. There are going to be consequences to those errors. And yet, if we live a rich and successful life, we can afford those consequences. We can dip into our savings and say, whatever I did wrong, I can make up for it. Whatever went wrong, even if it was through no fault of my own, I have the rich resources to make this life successful, to make it possible to cover any of those losses. And so I'm glad you made that point. We're not infallible, and we're not incapable of error or mistakes. As long as we are virtuous, it doesn't matter. The whole reason to be virtuous is because life is complicated, as you said, and yet success is possible, just
Right.
as error is possible, and yet certainty is possible.
Come clean with your mistakes, people. Be grateful for correction, people. Be thoughtful about what you do. If you have an opportunity, think it through. Make sure you know what you're doing. That's basically what objectivism is teaching us. Yes, and to do that, we have to think conceptually and we have to think in principles. But it is our attempt to deal with all of the potentials in life that make that urgently important. And if we do that, there's a certain self-satisfaction and confidence that still comes with that. I still have the means of correcting my error. I still have the means of making better choices and getting better outcomes. So what I would say is, yeah, humans are capable of making mistakes, but that in itself makes it urgent that people be thoughtful and rational about all of their decisions, and philosophical and moral in terms of developing their own character, so that their own normal way of approaching things is based on their best understanding and knowledge of the world. It screams, if I could just say it, it just screams out a lesson to us. Philosophy, who needs it? Everyone. Everyone.
Yes, and we can take that inspiration from Howard Roark, who makes a number of mistakes and says he made mistakes. Oh, I shouldn't have done that. I never should have helped you with your buildings, Peter Keating. And several points in the book where the great thing about Roark, of course, is he will acknowledge a mistake and yet say, and yet I'm glad I did it, or I'm glad we lived through it. I'm glad, he says, if they take, when they're in the Stoddard Temple, if they take all of this away from us, wasn't it worth the experience? Wasn't it worth living through this? And you don't have to go to fiction. You can find your heroes in real life. I've been thinking about Bethany Hamilton, surfer, one of the great surfers, and she lost an arm, and she still is one of the greatest surfers in the world. I've got a quote on my refrigerator. She says, the quote from her is, I don't need easy, I just need possible.
Oh, that, my friends, is virtue. That, my friends, is absolute virtue. You're looking at it right there.
Speaking of losing an arm, I think of Rick Allen, the drummer in Def Leppard. A sports car accident, loses an arm. The band keeps him on. He is still their drummer to this day, a one-armed drummer, and a better drummer than a lot of them out there. I don't
better drummer than I could be.
Yeah.
He is 1,000 times better with one arm than I could do with two if I worked hard at it.
Yeah. It's not the falling down, it's the staying down.
It's this.
So, exactly. James, thank you for choosing these questions this week. Coming back from vacation and then getting into a rich, but in some ways also a light topic like this, it just applied objectivism, applied philosophy. And I think the more of that, the better. So I thank you very much for the topic this week. Now, next week is going to be great because, again, Catherine Dickerson is going to join us, and her partner, Brian Cross, is going to be on the show. And she is bringing on Leanne Biederman, who is, she describes her as a pet mom, PET, parent effectiveness training. So we are going to get both the teachers and, I won't say the student, but the applied PET that we discussed on the previous episode. Folks, you've got to tune in for that, May 3rd, next Wednesday, our usual Wednesday show. But again, there's going to be 5 of us on. I'm sure we're going to let Brian and Leanne and Catherine do most of the work, the heavy lifting, because what they are doing, again, if you saw the previous episode, but the techniques of effectiveness training, and both in professional effectiveness training and parenthood effectiveness training, and letting people be firsthand, think for themselves, letting children think for themselves and use their own minds rather than feeding them the right thing to do and the right things and wrong things to do. And that conversation was so good. I am looking forward to having it again and seeing how the training went with the folks at HBL.
Yeah, that's going to be fascinating. I can't miss it. And I am mostly just going to be shutting up and learning. No, please, folks. I got so much from the last talk with Catherine. I know that you guys will too. So definitely do tune in next Wednesday. It's going to be a great show.
And I know the focus was on parenting, but she also talked about business, professional effectiveness training, just communication skills, and active listening, and they've taken that to the nth degree. That is going to be good next May 3rd. Folks, do not miss it. Now, we've got the Daily Objective coming up in 1 hour, so please be sure to be on the Ayn Rand Center UK channel. I don't have the topic in front of me, but I know it's going to be good. James, you've been doing an awful lot of shows ever since, our friend Rucka Ali has gone on to do more of his personal work. You have really been picking up the reins. You and Mark Pellegrino and Jonathan Honig have really been producing some outstanding content.
We had an interesting show yesterday too on the dismissal of Tucker Carlson from Fox News with Nikos. I enjoy doing it when I do have something to add, and happy to do it. We do important work here at the Ayn Rand Center UK, folks. We're creating an international community of students of objectivism, one that's able to exchange their views and like we are doing here, continuing the learning process and involve you all. And I am deeply grateful for everyone who supports us as subscribers and as members. We've started a new Leonard Peikoff course on Sundays, The History of Philosophy. If you subscribe now, you can still get in on the ground floor. Really, we've just barely begun. So definitely consider becoming a supporter of Ayn Rand Center UK. I am privileged, honored, and proud to participate, Robert. We're doing, I think, important work here.
Outstanding. So folks, be sure to tune in an hour. Join us for the Daily Objective. Thank you for listening. Thank you for James. Thank you for this topic. I love the title, Oops, the Consequences of Error. But yes, people make mistakes, and it's not about the mistakes we make, but what we do about them going forward. And looking forward to next Wednesday. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, everybody out there, for listening. We will see you next Wednesday. Have an outstanding, value-laden, relatively mistake-free day.
Take care.